So is it all about supply and demand in terms of what's going on with fossil fuels? The point I want to make here is demand is a large part of the story. This picture, the simple way to think of it is this is increase in world oil consumption in millions of barrels per day. The thing that you should notice is that blue segment. The real surprise was the emergence of China as a major source of growth in world oil consumption. So certainly a large part of the story in terms of the big run-up in the summer of 2008 was certainly China's consumption. But lots of what's going on has nothing to do with, quote, demand and supply factors. It has to do with what economists like to call good old market power. In other words, the ability of OPEC and the countries of the OPEC nations to essentially coordinate output to keep prices at levels that allow them to continue to live the lifestyles they like to live. And Saudi Arabia is certainly one of the coordinators of that. And coordinating this world demand coordinating the supply of the OPEC nations in order to keep prices up is certainly easy when demand is extremely high, largely because oil production is subject to capacity constraints in the short run. And so the big issue is if everybody's producing at capacity and that's setting a very high price, then the world's wonderful. The only thing you have to worry about is people adding to capacity. The bigger problem comes when demand craters. And that's precisely what often happens and is a large part of why we see these tremendously volatile prices in the world oil, because of how well this sort of sloppy cartel manages to keep prices up. So are we running out of fossil fuels? This diagram is taken from a paper cited here. What this gives you is like a supply curve. And the simple way to think of this is essentially the supply of all near oil equivalents. And this gives each of the technologies. So for example, enhanced oil recovery, gas to liquids, coal to liquids, et cetera. The height gives you the price at which that should kick in. The important thing to notice is these prices are certainly below the price that we're seeing right now for oil. So what's happening? Why aren't these investments occurring? But the important point as well that I want you to get from this diagram is this right here is the total amount of fossil fuel that we've consumed since the beginning of time. Okay, so the point being is that we got lots of fossil fuel left over. And remember, take the caveat that I talked about with respect to reserves and things like that, factor that into this picture. This represents what the authors thought at the time with existing technologies. Who knows what the technologies that are out there in the future? So what's the big challenge in the fossil fuel sector is figuring out how to essentially plow through that supply curve in a way that essentially, if you like, imposes the least amount of costs on the consuming nations. We're a big consuming nation. And the thing is dealing with this is no different from how you deal with any other supplier that has market power. You've got to figure out ways to essentially get demand to be flexible. As we said, flexibility in demand, ready availability substitutes for the energy services provided by fossil fuels and provided by oil. If we can shift away and still get the same energy services, then essentially we're limiting the ability of OPEC to do the things that it does with the price of oil. So, we want substitutes for OPEC oil. Electrification is certainly a large part of that. Hybrids, plug-in hybrids, fuel switching capability, ethanol, Brazil's solution of essentially flex fuel vehicles for all the fuels, use of natural gas, compressed natural gas in the transportation sector is another one. So certainly one good thing we can do as environmental citizens is increase the extent of integration in the world natural gas market. So world natural gas market looks a lot like the world oil market about 30 years ago. Very, very regional, not very global, very little transnational shipments of natural gas. The big complication here is you've got to liquefy it to send it to some place, which means you've got to put an expensive facility that looks a lot like a bomb in a very, very politically unstable place. And then you have to have a facility at the other end that essentially liquefies it again, gasifies it again to be able to put it in the distribution network. So But the benefits are quite substantial. In particular, I did a calculation a few years ago to essentially figure out how much gets flamed off at the site, because natural gas and oil occur together. And it's roughly on the order of about California's annual natural gas consumption. Remember, 1 in 8 people in California live in California, and the other 7 hate them. But effectively, it is so that's and California consumes a lot of natural gas relative to the rest of the United States. In other words, virtually all of our fossil fuel-fired power plants in California are natural gas-fired. So we're far more intensive in terms of natural gas. So it's a large amount of, if you like, stuff that's producing CO2 that really is not doing any useful work. Okay, so essentially, if we're not running out, then what's the problem? It's essentially environmental concerns. And it's carbon dioxide emissions, as we say, and a bunch of local pollutants. And so the big problem here is doing what economists like to call is internalizing externality. Of the private cost of producing and consuming these fuels is less than the cost to society from producing and consuming these fuels. And so we need to internalize that cost. In other words, charge me the cost that I cause to everybody else here when I drive my car and I emit those pollutants that I emit. And essentially, this typical ways that it's done is to figure out a way to set a price for carbon. This can be done either through a carbon fee or through a cap and trade mechanism. Either approach can essentially do this at least cost to society. And what you prefer is largely due to the approach that you think in terms of which you know. If you know the cost, then you probably want to go with a price, a carbon fee. If you know the sort of maximum allowable emissions that you want to achieve, then you probably should go with a cap and trade. But there are also political things that you want to layer on top of this. And that's essentially where we get a number of these policies, which are renewable portfolio standards, corporate average fuel efficiency standards, low carbon fuel standards. All of these are extremely costly in terms of dollars per carbon mitigated relative to these sorts of mechanisms that essentially would set an explicit price. Because here what you're doing is saying, this is how I want to get it, whereas here you're saying, I'm going to do like we do in everything else. I'm going to set a price, and if you can beat that price, you're in. Whereas here I'm telling you exactly how I'm going to get it. And so essentially, a stable and predictable price of carbon is really the way that we're going to do it. And the important thing is predictable price into distant future, because we want people to invest. That carbon fee is the most straightforward way I can think of to do that. This just shows you what people are doing. The last point that I wanted to make is tying together the points that I made at the beginning as to why we don't see investments in coal. We don't see that BTU arbitrage on coal that we're seeing, say, in natural gas, because remember, natural gas is slightly less carbon intensive than oil, but coal is much more carbon intensive than CO2 per unit of useful energy produced. And so it is this uncertainty in climate policy, because why? Most of these near oil projects are huge upfront cost, pretty low variable cost. And they're economic, certainly in the current range that we see prices. But what they're not economic is at a non-zero price of carbon. And if we see a price of carbon that's extremely high, I made that huge upfront investment. All of a sudden now I'm uneconomic and I'm out of business. Well, I'm a good businessman and I understand that political risk, so that's not something I'm going to do. And so essentially I avoid this upfront investment because of this uncertainty in carbon policy, which then tells the OPEC countries, great, now $100 a barrel is your sweet spot for the price of oil, because their big fear is leaving a whole bunch of oil in the ground and not selling it for anything. So they don't want these things to occur. But the nice thing is they're getting a lot of help from the fact that we have this uncertainty in climate policy, because of the fact that businessmen aren't going to invest knowing that this sort of risk exists for them. So these are just to say we're not running out. The big issue is integrating the fossil fuel market and real problem of dealing and getting a price of carbon.